now to forecast the next 7 days, here is UNL Extension statewide climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we are again. It's time for the weekly weather forecast. And before we get to the forecast, of course, let's look at the conditions over the last week. We did see a cool down earlier in the week, and we've seen some scattered thunderstorm activity as a trough moves into the Pacific Northwest, develop over the Panhandle region. Now, this is some of the more significant moisture we've seen in quite a while, and it still hasn't been as widespread as we'd like to see, but at this point in time, we'll take any moisture we can get. Now, in terms of the latest drought monitor, we are starting to show a dramatic increase in the dryness across Nebraska. We have moderate drought conditions across most of the Panhandle, outside a very thin sliver of northern portion of the Panhandle. We have drought encroaching into portions of southwest, south central Nebraska, and we have moderate drought conditions that have now been painted for portions of extreme southeastern Nebraska. If the precipitation trend that is projected by the models continues for this weekend, we're not expecting nearly as much moisture across the eastern part of the state as was originally forecasted a couple days ago, and therefore we may actually see more northern progression of that dryness issue as we see next week's drought monitor. And we're starting to also get some pretty significant reports of stress right along the Kansas-Nebraska border in response to this increase in temperatures. Do we have any significant moisture in store? Well, most of it's going to come this weekend if it's going to happen, and let's take a look at the upper models and see why the reason for that precipitation. And that is because we do have an upper air trough that is moving in and is expected to lift into the northern plains. So we will have some lift associated with this system. There's possibility of some scattered thunderstorm activity along what will be a cool front moving through the state, particularly on Sunday. But we should see some scattered thunderstorm activity across the Panhandle, very isolated, but at least there's a chance for precipitation. We're looking at highs in the upper 80s across the northwest to possibly even the mid-90s across the extreme south and southeastern Nebraska. Now, as we go into Sunday, this system is going to lift out, and that's going to push a cold front slowly through the state and give us a shot of precipitation, although most of the moisture and energy remains to our north. We'll be looking at highs in the northwest somewhere in the low 80s, and as we get into southeastern Nebraska before the front passes through, we'll probably touch the low 90s. Now, as we go into Monday, this system slowly moves its way into the Great Lakes, and we start to see some of that cold air filtering southward. So we'll be looking at highs right now in the mid to upper 70s across the northeast, although that might be just a little too cold. And we'll be looking at pretty much highs in the mid-80s across extreme southeastern Nebraska, with precipitation coming in during the second half of the day. Now, as we go into Tuesday, we're going to see that trough moving to our east, and we're going to start to get a slight northwesterly flow in the upper atmosphere, bringing in some cooler, drier air into the region. We're looking at highs primarily in the mid to upper 70s across the north to the lower 80s across the south. Very short-lived cool down, because by the time we get to Wednesday, we see the ridge trying to lift back in, and we'll be looking at highs primarily in the low 80s across north and northeastern Nebraska to the upper 80s across southwest Nebraska. As we go into Thursday, the ridge starts to build even farther. We bump the temperature up 5 degrees or so. We're looking at highs in the mid-80s across the northeast to the low 90s across the southwest, with a chance for isolated thunderstorms across the Panhandle region. As we go into Friday, another trough moves in. Very warm conditions start to move into our region, and we might start to see an increase in the humidity levels. We're looking at highs in the upper 80s across the northeast to the mid-90s across the west. The 8 to 14 day forecast, which includes next weekend, indicates a trend for above normal temperatures continues, and we have an increasing chance for precipitation as the weekend progresses.